The rain fell against the floor-to-ceiling glass, a frantic, desperate rhythm against the city's muted hum, but the only sound Alara could truly hear was the ragged edge of her own breathing. Each gasp was a betrayal, a confession of the pleasure she had promised herself she would never feel. His body moved against hers, a powerful, deliberate cadence that owned the space, the night, and now, her. She arched her back, the silk sheets cool against her heated skin, a whisper escaping her lips, lost somewhere between a plea and a prayer. "Julian, please, slow down." His grip on her hips only tightened, a possessive anchor in the storm of sensation, pulling her closer until there was no separation between them, just skin and heat and the heavy scent of his cologne. "You know you don't mean that, Alara." His voice was a low rumble against her ear, a sound that was both a caress and a command. "You belong to me tonight." And in that moment, under the weight of his body and the gaze of 1,000 distant city lights, she knew it was true. This act, this surrender, was a transaction sealed not with a signature, but with the silent scream of her soul. Just hours earlier, that soul had felt like it was withering inside a cramped studio apartment that smelled of turpentine and despair. Alara had sat at a small, wobbly table staring at a stack of pristine white envelopes. They were letters from the hospital, from creditors, each one a paper-thin shiv threatening to sever the last thread of her family's hope. Her art history degree, once a source of pride, now felt like a cruel joke, gathering dust while her mother's medical bills gathered interest. Desperation was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach that had grown tighter with each passing day, until it had finally choked out every last remnant of her pride. That was when she made the call. That was when she had dressed herself in the nicest, most modest dress she owned, and walked into the lion's den, the office of Julian Vance, the father of the man she once thought she would marry. Now, in his bed, the memory of her own worn-out apartment felt like a lifetime away. The contrast was dizzying, a form of vertigo that left her breathless. She had traded her world of peeling paint and overdue notices for this gilded cage in the sky, a place where the sheets were softer than a whisper, and the silence was worth more than everything she had ever owned. She had made a bargain, not with a devil, but with a man who owned a piece of the sky, and in return, he now owned a piece of her. The decision wasn't made in a single dramatic moment. It was forged in the quiet desperation of 3 a.m., in the week of sleepless nights where the ceiling of her apartment became a blank screen for her worst fears. It was built from the strained, cheerful tone in her mother's voice over the phone, a bravery that was more heartbreaking than any admission of pain. And it was solidified by the final, polite but firm letter from the collections agency, a masterclass in bureaucratic cruelty. Each possible solution she had entertained had dissolved into smoke. Another loan was impossible. Her credit was non-existent. A second job waiting tables would barely make a dent. The world, in its infinite, uncaring vastness, had presented her with a sheer, unscalable wall of debt. And it was in the deepest pit of that despair that the memory surfaced, a ghost from a happier time. A memory of Leo, sprawled on the grass in a park, laughing as he talked about his father. "He's a shark, Alara," he had said, not with malice, but with a kind of resigned awe. "A true predator. But he's the shark that owns the entire ocean." The ocean, Alara thought, was exactly what she was drowning in. The memory, once a trivial piece of conversation, now felt like a compass point, the only direction left to turn. It was a humiliating, terrifying prospect. She and Leo had ended things amicably over a year ago, a slow drifting apart caused by different life paths. But the thought of approaching his father felt like a profound betrayal of that clean, simple past. It felt like crawling back, not to Leo, but to the source of the power and privilege that had always separated their worlds. Yet, the image of her mother's tired face was a more potent force than her own pride. So, she had woken up one morning, the hollow ache of hunger in her stomach indistinguishable from the gnawing of fear, and put on her armor. It wasn't much, just a simple navy blue dress she'd bought for a job interview 2 years ago, a pair of sensible heels that pinched her toes, and a thin layer of makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She was preparing for a battle she was certain she would lose. The Vance Tower wasn't just a building, it was a monument to a world she was never meant to enter. It pierced the city skyline, a shard of glass and steel that seemed to mock the gray, struggling streets below. Stepping out of the grimy, crowded subway and into the pristine, cathedral-like lobby was a culture shock so profound it made her dizzy. The air was different here, cooler, smelling faintly of money, and an expensive, unidentifiable floral scent. The marble floors gleamed, reflecting her worn-out shoes with brutal clarity. Men in perfectly tailored suits and women who dripped quiet elegance glided past her, their faces impassive, their eyes looking straight through the insignificant girl in the navy dress. She clutched her portfolio to her chest, the folder containing her resume and degree feeling laughably thin, a pathetic offering to the gods of this place. The elevator ride to the penthouse floor was silent and swift, a smooth, stomach-lurching ascent that felt like a journey to another realm. His office was, as she had expected, less of a room and more of a kingdom. One entire wall was a window, offering a god's eye view of the city sprawling below, the cars and people reduced to insignificant specks. A massive mahogany desk sat like an altar in the center of the room, and behind it, Julian Vance rose to his feet. He was not the stooped, aging patriarch she had vaguely pictured. At 55, he was a man at the zenith of his power. His dark hair was threaded with distinguished silver at the temples. His face was lined with experience rather than age, and his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, held an unnerving intelligence. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than her entire year's rent, and it fit him with an ease that spoke of a lifetime of custom tailoring. He was handsome, she realized with a jolt, in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with power. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice smoother and deeper than she anticipated. He didn't extend a hand. He simply gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Please." Sitting down, Alara felt herself shrink. The chair was so large, it seemed to swallow her whole. She began her carefully rehearsed speech, her voice trembling only slightly at the beginning. She spoke of her qualifications, her degree, her desperate need for a better-paying position, carefully framing her plea as a professional inquiry. She slid her resume across the vast expanse of polished wood. As she spoke, he didn't interrupt. He simply watched her, his blue eyes moving from her face, to her hands twisting in her lap, to the pulse fluttering nervously at the base of her throat. It was a gaze that was not lecherous, but something far more unsettling. It was assessing. He was cataloging her, measuring her, from the slight fraying on her dress cuff to the desperate hope in her eyes. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the city far below. He finally picked up her resume, though he barely glanced at it. "An art history major," he mused, his eyes meeting hers again. "Leo spoke of you. He mentioned you had a particular passion for the pre-Raphaelites, a deep appreciation for tragic beauty." The personal reference was a subtle shock, a reminder that she wasn't just another applicant. She was his son's ex-girlfriend. It immediately changed the dynamic, stripping away the thin veneer of professionalism she had tried so hard to maintain. Yes, she managed to say. "I find their work compelling." He leaned forward slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Tragedy can be compelling, Miss Collins. It can also be motivating." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her, a silhouette against the world he so clearly owned. "Your situation," he said, his voice resonating in the quiet room, "is unfortunate. Your loyalty to your family is admirable, but this firm does not have a suitable position for someone with your specific qualifications." A cold wave of defeat washed over Alara. It was over. She had debased herself for nothing. She started to gather her purse, preparing to leave. "However," he said, turning back to face her, the look in his eyes had changed. The professional mask was gone, replaced by that same assessing intensity, but now it was tinged with something else, something proprietary. "I believe your problem requires a more creative solution than simple employment. A solution that is faster, more direct." He walked back toward his desk but didn't sit down. He stood over her, a towering presence. "I am always looking for new investments, things of beauty and potential that require patronage." He let the word hang in the air, rich with unspoken meaning. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She understood. She understood with a clarity that was both horrifying and sickeningly alluring. He wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her a cage, a beautifully gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. She came here seeking a loan, a lifeline to pull her family from the depths, and instead, he was offering to buy her very soul. Patronage. The word hung in the air-conditioned stillness of the office, as beautiful and as cold as the glass tower that surrounded them. It was a word Alara knew from her textbooks, a word associated with Renaissance masters and wealthy benefactors, with art and creation. But from Julian Vance's lips, it felt different. It felt stripped of its noble history, repurposed into something clinical and modern, an elegant term for a transaction that was anything but. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, a primal instinct to stand, to gather the shredded remnants of her dignity, and walk out. He had seen her desperation and put a price tag on it. He was looking at her not as a potential employee, not even as his son's former girlfriend, but as a beautiful, tragic object he could acquire. A war raged within the confines of her skull, silent and violent. One voice, the one that sounded like the girl she used to be, the girl who believed in hard work and self-respect, screamed at her to run. It urged her to throw the insult back in his perfectly handsome face, to tell him that she was not for sale. But another voice, a colder, more pragmatic whisper that sounded terrifyingly like her own, silenced it. This new voice counted medical bills in the dead of night. It calculated interest rates and imagined the stark, sterile walls of a state-run nursing home. It felt the phantom weight of her mother's hand, frail and trembling, in hers. This voice knew that pride was a luxury, a delicacy she could no longer afford. So she stayed silent, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. Her silence was a vacuum, and Julian Vance filled it with the smooth, measured cadence of his voice. He moved away from the window, circling his desk not to sit, but to perch on its edge, closer to her, a casual gesture that was a calculated invasion of her space. The power dynamic shifted palpably. He was no longer behind his fortress of mahogany, but looming over her, a predator assessing its cornered prey. "Let's be frank, Alara," he said, and the use of her first name was a deliberate stroke, an act of forced intimacy that made her flinch. "Your loyalty is to your family. My loyalty is to my own interests. On occasion, those two things can align to create a mutually beneficial arrangement." He spoke as if outlining a merger, his tone devoid of emotion, yet his eyes were doing all the emotional work. They traced the line of her collarbone, visible above the modest neckline of her dress. They lingered for a fraction of a second on her lips, as if imagining them saying his name. They scanned the tired lines around her eyes and seemed to understand the sleepless nights that had put them there. "I am a busy man," he continued, his voice a low, persuasive hum. "My life is complicated. It involves certain social obligations, fundraisers, private dinners with clients. My wife does not enjoy these functions." The casual mention of a wife was another calculated blow, erasing any possibility of romance, framing this proposed relationship in the stark, unadorned light of pure convenience. "I require a companion. Someone intelligent, poised, and beautiful, who can discuss art and politics with the same ease. Someone who can be a charming asset at my side when needed, and who can appreciate the value of absolute discretion." He paused, letting the words sink in. He never said the word sex. He never mentioned a bed. He didn't have to. The omission was louder than any crass proposal. It was all there, shimmering beneath the surface of his corporate language. Exclusivity, availability, submission. He gestured vaguely at her simple dress. "That color suits you," he said, the compliment landing like a stone. "But the fabric doesn't do you justice. You have the kind of classical beauty that deserves to be framed in silk, in cashmere, not polyester." It was breathtakingly arrogant, a simultaneous compliment and dismissal that told her everything she needed to know. He didn't just want her body, he wanted to curate her, to transform her into his personal work of art. He would be her patron in every sense of the word. He would pay her debts, yes, but he would also choose her clothes, shape her schedule, and own her time. The life he was offering was one of borrowed glamour, a reflection of his own wealth. In return for this companionship, he said, his gaze finally locking with hers, pinning her to the chair, all of your family's financial burdens would simply disappear. The debt would be settled. A generous monthly stipend would be deposited into an account for you, enough to live comfortably, to ensure your mother receives the best possible care. You would have access to a world you've only read about in your history books. He was selling her a fantasy, a twisted fairy tale where the prince was a married corporate raider and the glass slipper was a pair of designer heels he would pay for. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between revulsion and temptation, and he pressed his advantage. There would be no contract, no messy paperwork. Just a simple, private understanding between two adults. Your life would be your own, outside of the time I require. All I ask for is your loyalty and your presence when I call for it. He finally pushed himself off the desk and returned to his chair, the interview suddenly, jarringly over. The shift back to a formal distance was designed to confuse her, to make her feel as if she had imagined the intimacy, the raw nature of the proposal. He picked up a sterling silver pen and glanced at a document, dismissing her before she had even spoken a word. "I won't press you for an answer now, Alara," he said, his eyes on the paper. "This is a significant decision. Go home, look at your bills, look at your future as it stands today. Then decide what kind of life you truly want to live." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick black business card, sliding it across the desk. It had only his name and a single phone number, no title, no company logo. It was a key to a secret door. "This is my private number. If you decide to accept my offer, you call this number. If I don't hear from you, I will understand and you will never hear from me again." Numbly, Alara stood up. Her legs felt unsteady. She took the card, its weight feeling obscene in her trembling hand. She managed a choked, barely audible, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Vance," the polite words tasting like ash in her mouth. He simply nodded, already absorbed in his work. She had been erased from his reality the moment the business at hand was concluded. The elevator ride down was a descent in every sense. She felt hollowed out, as if he had performed a kind of psychic surgery on her, removing her pride and leaving a cold, empty space behind. As she stepped back out into the noisy, chaotic city street, the world seemed both hyper-real and completely alien. The sun was too bright, the traffic too loud. She walked for blocks in a daze, the heavy black card clutched in her fist. He had given her a choice, but it was the illusion of choice. He had shown her two doors, one leading to a slow, grinding poverty that would destroy her family, and the other leading to a gilded cage that would destroy her. And as the tears she had held back in his office finally began to stream down her face, she knew with a soul-crushing certainty which door she was going to open. For 3 days, the black business card sat on Alara's kitchen table, a rectangle of pure darkness that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. It was a constant, silent accusation. Every time she looked at it, she heard Julian Vance's voice, smooth and reasonable, outlining the terms of her surrender. Every time she looked away, she saw her mother's face, etched with worry and pain. It was a choice between two different kinds of heartbreak, and the grim arithmetic always led to the same answer. On the 4th day, she stopped fighting. With a hand that trembled so badly she could barely press the numbers, she made the call. He answered on the 2nd ring, his voice crisp and devoid of surprise. "Vance." She swallowed, her throat dry. It's Alara Collins." A brief pause, and then, "I was expecting your call. A car will pick you up at 8 p.m. tomorrow. Wear something appropriate for a dinner at the Cillian Club." And then he hung up. There was no warmth, no gloating, just cold, clear instruction. The deal was in motion. The next evening, at precisely 7 o'clock, a courier delivered a long, flat box from a high-end boutique she had only ever seen in magazines. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a dress the color of a deep emerald forest. The silk felt like liquid in her hands, impossibly smooth and cool. It was a dress that cost more than she made in 2 months, and it was a uniform. As she slipped it on, she felt a chilling transformation take place. The dress fit as if it had been made for her, clinging to her waist and hips, the neckline elegantly framing her collarbones. Looking in her small, cracked bathroom mirror, she saw a stranger. This woman was poised, her beauty no longer fragile but highlighted, polished, and presented. She was an object of value, and the dress was her packaging. Alara Collins, the worried daughter and struggling graduate, was gone. In her place was Julian's companion. The Cillian Club was a bastion of old money, all dark wood, worn leather, and the hushed murmur of powerful men making quiet deals. Julian was waiting for her, and when she walked in, he stood, his eyes doing a slow, appreciative sweep from her hair down to the hem of her new dress. "Perfect," was all he said, but the single word was laden with the satisfaction of a collector who had just acquired a prized piece. The dinner was a masterclass in seduction, all the more potent for its subtlety. He didn't speak of their arrangement. He didn't mention money or her family. Instead, he asked her about her thesis. He spoke of his own art collection, discussing the nuances of a painting by Waterhouse he had recently acquired. He drew her out, made her talk about her passions, and he listened with an intensity that was deeply unnerving and dangerously flattering. He made her feel intelligent, witty, and seen in a way no one had in a very long time. For a few treacherous moments, she could almost forget why she was there. She could almost believe this was a real date, that this handsome, powerful man was genuinely interested in her mind. But then his knee would brush against hers under the table, a touch that lingered just a second too long. Or his fingers would graze the back of her hand as he reached for his wineglass, sending a jolt of unwanted electricity through her. And his eyes were always watching her, over the rim of his glass, across the flickering candlelight, a constant, possessive gaze that reminded her this was all a performance, a prelude to the evening's main event. The tension built with every course, a thick, unspoken thing that filled the space between them until Alara could barely breathe. After dinner, as they stood outside in the cool night air, he turned to her. "I have some remarkable pieces at my apartment, and the view of the city, as an artist, you would appreciate it." It was the pretext she had been expecting, the elegant lie to bridge the gap between the public respectability of the dinner club and the private shame of what was to come. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her consent. The drive to his penthouse was a silent, surreal journey through a city sparkling with millions of lights, each one a life, a story, completely separate from the sordid one she was now living. The apartment was even more vast and intimidating than she remembered from her interview. It was a palace of glass and steel, impeccably decorated but utterly sterile, lacking any personal touch. It was a place for transactions, not for living. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, handing one to her. Her hand shook as she took it. She walked to the immense window, wrapping her arms around herself as she stared out at the glittering abyss below. This was it, the precipice. He came to stand behind her, not touching her, but his presence was a physical weight, his clean, expensive scent enveloping her. The final, desperate words of the girl she used to be clawed their way out of her throat, a choked whisper. "Mr. Vance, I don't think I can do this." He was silent for a moment. She could feel his gaze on her reflection in the dark glass. Then, he set his drink down on a nearby table with a soft, definitive click. His movements were unhurried, his control absolute. He stepped closer, his warmth at her back, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders, a gesture that could have been comforting from anyone else, but from him, felt like the closing of a cage. "Call me Julian," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear that made her skin prickle. His fingers found the tiny hidden zipper at the back of her emerald dress. "And yes," he said as he began to pull it slowly, deliberately down, the sound like the tearing of silk, like the ripping apart of her old life. "You can." The cool air of the apartment on her exposed skin was a shock. The dress pooled at her feet, a puddle of green silk, leaving her vulnerable and exposed in her simple underwear before the indifferent city lights. Tears began to stream silently down her face, but she didn't make a sound. It was as if her voice had been zipped away with the dress. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle but firm, and his eyes held not passion, but a cool, terrifying ownership. This wasn't about love or even lust. It was about possession. The journey to the bedroom was a blur of shame. The sheets of his bed were impossibly soft, a final mocking touch of luxury in her degradation. His first touch was a brand. His body was powerful, experienced, moving with a rhythm that was entirely for his own pleasure. Alara closed her eyes, trying to dissociate, to travel somewhere else in her mind, back to a sunlit park with Leo, anywhere but here. But her body was a traitor. It was a machine of nerve endings and responses she couldn't control. A gasp escaped her lips, A shiver ran through her, a biological reaction that felt like the most profound form of self-betrayal. Her whispered protests. "Julian, no, please," were so faint they were lost in the rustle of the sheets, absorbed by the silence of the vast, empty room. It was not the fiery, passionate affair of novels. It was a quiet, methodical claiming, a finalization of the contract that had been offered in his office and signed with her silent tears on his 1,000-count silk sheets. The transaction was complete. The morning after felt like a desecration. Alara awoke to the cold, impersonal light of dawn filtering into a bedroom that was not hers, in a bed that felt as vast and empty as a desert. Julian was gone. There was no note, no lingering warmth on the pillow next to her, just the faint, clinical scent of his cologne hanging in the air. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, a soundproof tomb high above the waking city. She felt a profound, hollowed-out shame that was so intense it was physical, an ache deep in her bones. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the zipper of the emerald dress, which now felt like a costume from a sordid play. Leaving the apartment, walking through the silent living room, she felt like a ghost, a trespasser. The doorman in the lobby didn't meet her eyes as she scurried out into the harsh morning light, a tacit acknowledgement of her role, a confirmation of her disgrace. The subway ride back to her own world was a journey through the circles of hell, the press of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, a brutal reminder of the life she had just sold. She spent the day in a fugue state, huddled in her small apartment, the memory of the night before replaying in a torturous loop. She didn't eat. She just waited, though for what, she wasn't sure. Condemnation? The next summons? Late in the afternoon, her phone buzzed with an alert from her banking app. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it, her vision blurring, and then she saw it, a number so large it seemed fictional. A series of zeros that represented her freedom and her damnation. The wave of relief that washed over her was so powerful it made her sick, and she had to brace herself against the wall, a sob catching in her throat. It was the price of her body, the cost of her soul. The numbers on the screen were a blessing and a curse, a salvation and a brand. An hour later, sitting at her wobbly kitchen table, she logged into the hospital's payment portal. Her fingers, slick with a nervous sweat, typed in the long account number. She entered the payment amount, the number she had seen in her nightmares for months. With a final, trembling breath, she clicked the Submit Payment button. A small green confirmation message appeared on the screen. "Thank you. Your payment has been received." A weight she had been carrying for so long it had become a part of her was suddenly, miraculously, lifted. But in its place, a heavier, colder burden settled. She had saved her mother, but she had damned herself. The gilded cage began to assemble itself around her, piece by piece, not with iron bars, but with cardboard boxes tied with silk ribbons. 2 days after the money appeared, the first delivery arrived. It was a large box from a department store where she was afraid to even touch the merchandise. Inside was not a ball gown or cocktail dress, but a collection of casual wear, a cloud-soft cashmere sweater, jeans that fit her body perfectly, elegant leather boots. It was a quiet, insidious statement from Julian. He was not just curating her appearance for their nights together, he was refitting her entire life. Her small closet, once filled with thrift store finds and fast fashion staples, began to feel inadequate, shabby. Another delivery brought skincare, expensive creams and serums in heavy glass jars that promised to erase the tired lines of worry from her face. He was polishing his investment. His calls became the new rhythm of her life. They were never social, they were commands, delivered in his cool, even tone. "Be ready at 7 on Thursday, black dress." Or, "I have a business dinner in Boston next month. Keep the third weekend free." She began to live in a state of suspended animation, her life no longer her own, but a series of empty spaces between his summonses. A strange Pavlovian response began to develop. The specific, discreet ringtone she had assigned to his private number would send a jolt through her, a nauseating cocktail of dread and something else, a flicker of nervous anticipation, a morbid curiosity about what world he would drag her into next. The initial horror began to fade, worn down by routine. The shame was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but it was becoming familiar, a part of her new reality. The dinners became easier. She learned which fork to use, how to nod intelligently at conversations about stock prices and mergers. She learned to sip champagne and smile a vacant, beautiful smile. She became an expert at being an ornament. The nights in his bed became less of a violation and more of a grim, silent duty. She learned to quiet her mind, to detach, to perform the role he required. The luxury that had once felt so alien began to seep into her bones. She got used to the feel of high-thread count sheets, the taste of expensive wine, the silent, smooth ride of his town car. The bars of her cage were so exquisitely crafted, so beautifully polished, that sometimes, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, she would forget she was a prisoner at all. One rainy Tuesday, another box arrived. This one was smaller, from a lingerie boutique whose name was whispered like a secret. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a set of underwear made of the most delicate black lace and silk. It was impossibly beautiful and achingly erotic, a fantasy spun from thread. It was something Alara would never, in a million years, have chosen for herself. It was not for her, it was for him. It was a costume for a role she played in the dark. That night, after a long, empty day of waiting for a call that never came, a strange impulse seized her, a kind of morbid need to see, to confront the creature she was becoming. She took the lingerie into her bathroom and, under the harsh fluorescent light, she put it on. Then, she stood in front of the full-length mirror hanging on the back of her bedroom door, the one with the small crack in the lower corner. The reflection that stared back at her was a grotesque collage. It was her own face, pale and haunted, her familiar brown eyes wide with a kind of horror. It was her own body, but it was clad in the armor of a kept woman, the intricate black lace, a stark, vulgar web against her skin. Behind her, the reflection showed her real life, the peeling paint on the bedroom wall, the pile of art history books on her nightstand, the worn-out rug on the floor. The image was so profoundly discordant it made her feel dizzy. The woman in the mirror was a paradox, an expensive object displayed in a slum. Who was she? She touched the cool silk strap on her shoulder, her fingers tracing the foreign object. This body was hers, but the skin it covered, the life it was living, belonged to Julian Vance. He had paid for it, he had dressed it, he had used it. She was no longer Alara Collins. She was a reflection, a beautiful, empty thing he had created for his own pleasure. The tears that came were not hot with shame, but cold with a terrifying, absolute clarity. She was lost. The girl she had been was gone, and this stranger in the mirror was all that was left. She had fallen into a strange, suspended rhythm, a life lived in the quiet interludes between Julian's commands. Her small apartment had become a hybrid world, a museum of her past and present selves. Her worn, beloved art history books now sat on a sleek, modern bookshelf Julian had sent over. A luxurious cashmere throw, a casual gift, was draped over the lumpy, secondhand armchair she'd had since college. She was learning to live with these contradictions, to build a fragile peace in the quiet. The guilt was a constant companion, of course, but it had become a dull, chronic ache rather than a sharp, acute pain. She had managed to compartmentalize, to build walls in her mind. On one side was the arrangement, a grim but necessary business. On the other was everything else. It was a fragile system, but it was the only thing keeping her sane. She was curled in that very armchair, the cashmere soft against her skin, rereading a passage about the symbolism of fallen women in Victorian art. The irony was not lost on her when her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, and her stomach immediately clenched with the specific anxiety reserved for Julian using a new line. But when she answered, her voice a cautious hello, the response that came back was not his deep, commanding tone. It was a voice she hadn't heard in over a year, but it was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. A voice from another lifetime. Alara? Hey, it's Leo. The world tilted. The air in her lungs turned to ice, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Leo. The sound of his name in her own mind was a shock, a ghost bursting through the carefully constructed walls of her new reality. Her hand gripped the phone so tightly, her knuckles ached. She squeezed her eyes shut, and his face instantly appeared behind her eyelids. His easy smile, the earnest, kind look in his eyes. The face of the boy she had once loved, the boy whose father now owned her. "Leo," she finally managed to say, her voice a strangled whisper. "Wow. Hi. How did you get this number?" "I'm a detective," he joked, and his laugh was so warm, so normal, it was like a physical blow. "Nah, I called your mom to see how she was doing, and she gave it to me." "I hope that's okay. I've been thinking about you." Each word was a fresh turn of the screw. He had spoken to her mother. The thought of their two worlds intersecting, even in such an innocent way, sent a wave of panic through her. "Of course it's okay," she lied, forcing a lightness into her tone that felt grotesque. "It's good to hear from you. How are you?" "I'm good, yeah, really good," he said, and he sounded it. He told her about his new job at an architectural firm, a junior position, but one he was excited about. He talked about a trip he'd taken, a book he'd read. It was all so wonderfully, beautifully normal. It was the life she was supposed to have, the kind of conversation she was supposed to be having. But with every cheerful update from him, the chasm between their realities widened until it felt like an impassable canyon. Then, he asked the question she was dreading. "What about you, Elle? Mom said you have a new job, that you're doing really well. What is it?" Her mind raced. A frantic scramble for a plausible lie. The truth was impossible. "I'm the paid mistress of your father," was not a sentence that could be spoken. She had to construct a new identity. Right here, on the spot. "Oh, it's good," she began, the words feeling like marbles in her mouth. "I'm working as a private consultant for a private art collector. It's demanding, but it pays well. I get to work with some incredible pieces." The lie was terrifyingly close to the truth, a funhouse mirror version of her reality. She was an assistant to a private collector. She just left out the part where she, herself, was the central piece in his collection. "Wow, Alara, that's amazing," he said, his voice full of genuine pride for her. "I always knew you'd do something brilliant with that big brain of yours. Are you happy?" The question hung in the air, a simple, devastating inquiry. Was she happy? She looked around her gilded cage, at the cashmere and the designer boxes, and felt the cold weight of the answer in the pit of her stomach. "Yes," she lied, and the word was the ugliest sound she had ever made. "Yes, I am." The rest of the conversation was a blur of careful evasions and hollow laughter. She was an actress giving the performance of her life, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The call ended with the one thing she feared most. "Listen, I'd really love to see you," Leo said, his tone hopeful. "Just to catch up. For old time's sake. Can we get coffee next week?" The ticking bomb had been placed on her doorstep. Seeing him was impossible. The risk was too great. What if he saw her coming out of Julian's building? What if he asked too many questions? What if he simply looked into her eyes and saw the truth she was so desperately trying to hide? "I'd love that," she lied again, "but this new project is it's all-consuming right now. Maybe in a few weeks? Let me see when things calm down." The vague dismissal was the best she could do, and thankfully he accepted it, promising to call again soon. When she finally hung up the phone, she collapsed back into the armchair, her body trembling uncontrollably. The fragile peace was shattered, the quiet apartment now roaring with the sound of her guilt. The call had ripped open the carefully stitched wound of her past, and everything was bleeding out. Leo's voice, so full of warmth and innocence, had been a reminder of the person she used to be, the life she had thrown away. He was still living in a world of hope and coffee dates and honest work, while she was living in the shadows, a creature of transactions and lies. The expensive things around her suddenly seemed obscene, tainted. The cashmere sweater felt like it was woven from the threads of her deceit. The money in her bank account felt like blood money, the price for betraying not just herself, but the memory of a sweet, simple love. A wave of nausea washed over her. She ran to the bathroom and wretched, her body trying to expel a poison that was not in her stomach, but in her soul. Later that night, as she lay in bed, staring into the darkness, she could still hear his voice. Every kind word, every easy laugh, was a fresh torment. For the first time, she looked at Julian's arrangement not just as a deal she had made with a powerful stranger, but as a specific, intimate betrayal of Leo. She was sleeping with his father. The thought, which she had so carefully avoided formulating in her mind, now screamed at her from the shadows. It was a transgression so profound, so twisted, it felt like a violation of the natural order of things. Just as the panic began to subside into a cold, bleak despair, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Julian. The Street Regis, 9 p.m. Where the pearls? She stared at the screen, the two realities of her life converging with sickening force. The ghost of her innocent past had just called her, and now the master of her corrupt present was summoning her, and she, the woman trapped between them, had no choice but to answer the call. The guilt was a physical entity, a passenger in the back of the town car with her, its cold breath on her neck. Every street lamp they passed illuminated the memory of Leo's voice so full of warmth, of an innocence she had long since forfeited. He was out there living in a world of light and hope, while she was being ferried through the darkness to his father. The hypocrisy was a jagged pill in her throat. She hated herself for the lies she had told. She hated Julian for making her tell them, and most terrifyingly, she hated the part of her that, beneath the shame and the dread, felt a dark, electric anticipation for the night ahead. She wasn't just going to see Julian tonight, she was going to use him. She was going to plunge into the fire of their arrangement and let it burn away the ghost of her past. She needed the pain, the intensity, the oblivion only he could provide. The hotel suite at the Street Regis was opulent and anonymous, a space designed for secrets. Julian was standing by the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the city lights framing his powerful silhouette. He turned as she entered, his eyes doing their usual slow inventory of her appearance. She was wearing a simple black dress, the pearls he'd requested cool against her skin. He could see the storm in her eyes, the frantic energy humming just beneath her surface. "You seem agitated tonight, Alara," he observed, his voice calm, which only fueled her inner chaos. He was a mountain of control, and she was a tempest, and she felt a sudden, desperate need to see that mountain shake. She didn't answer him. She walked across the thick carpet, her heels sinking into the plush fibers, not stopping until she was directly in front of him. She didn't wait for him to make a move. She didn't wait for the usual, slow-burning seduction. Her hands came up, not to embrace him, but to grab the lapels of his perfectly tailored suit jacket. She pulled him down to her level, her mouth crashing against his in a kiss that was not tender or inviting, but ravenous and angry. It was a kiss full of teeth and desperation, a frantic attempt to erase the memory of Leo's gentle affection. Julian was momentarily surprised, his body tensing at the raw aggression of her attack. But it was only for a second. She felt a low growl rumble in his chest, a sound of predatory approval. This wasn't enough. The kiss wasn't enough to silence the voices in her head. She needed to break something. She needed to shatter the perfect, controlled facade of his world, and by extension, her own. Her hands slid from his lapels to the front of his crisp white shirt, and with a guttural sob of frustration, she ripped it open, the sound of tearing fabric and scattering buttons, shockingly loud in the quiet room. She pressed her face against his chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the words finally spilling out of her, raw and broken. "Make me forget, Julian," she pleaded into his skin. "Please, make me forget everything." For a moment, he simply held her, his hand tangled in her hair. She felt his control returning, blanketing her own chaos. He tilted her head back, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were dark, burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "I won't let you forget," he said, his voice a low, brutal promise. "I will make you remember, Alara. When you are drowning in this, you will remember nothing and no one but me." And with that, he was no longer the calm, collected businessman. He was the predator she had first glimpsed in his office. He swept her up into his arms, his mouth finding hers again, and this time, his kiss was not a response, but a conquest. He carried her into the bedroom, tossing her onto the sprawling bed. The pearls he had requested scattered across the white sheets like fallen tears. The black lace lingerie she wore beneath her dress, the one she had stared at in her mirror with such self-loathing, was torn away with an impatient growl. This was not the careful, almost reverent undressing of their first encounter. This was a frenzy, a storm of limbs and fabric. His hands were not gentle. They were branding irons, staking a claim. His fingers dug into the soft flesh of her hips, pulling her tight against him, his thumbs pressing into her skin, sure to leave bruises, a dark constellation of marks she could trace in the morning. His mouth left her lips to trail a fiery path down her throat, across her collarbone, finally closing over one of her breasts. She cried out, a sound that was half pain, half a pleasure so sharp it was almost unbearable. His touch was rough, possessive, exactly the punishment she had been craving. He moved over her, a dark shadow blocking out the world. The act itself was a tempest. It was not a union, it was a collision, a violent exorcism of her guilt. Every thrust was designed to shatter her thoughts, to replace the image of Leo's smile with the raw, physical reality of his father's body. She met his ferocity with her own, her nails digging into his back, her legs wrapping around him, pulling him deeper. She was seeking annihilation, a death of the self, and in the heat of their frenzied passion, she almost found it. The sounds that filled the room were not of love, but of a desperate primal need. The slick slide of skin, the ragged gasps for air, the low moans torn from their throats. In the eye of the storm, he leaned down, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a harsh command amidst the chaos. "Who do you belong to, Alara? Say my name." Her mind was a whiteout of sensation. There was no Leo. There was no past. There was only this room, this bed, this man. "Julian," she gasped, the name a surrender. "Oh, God. Julian." He pushed deeper, demanding more. "Say it all." And the final words of her submission came out on a broken sob, the ultimate confession, the ultimate betrayal. "I'm yours. I'm yours." When the climax finally came, it was not a gentle release, but a violent shattering, a moment where pleasure and pain were indistinguishable, wiping her mind clean. Afterwards, they lay tangled in the ruined sheets, their bodies slick with sweat, the air thick with the scent of sex and fury. There was no tenderness, no soft words. Julian's breathing was heavy beside her, his arm thrown possessively over her waist, trapping her. Alara stared at the ornate ceiling of the hotel room, her body aching, her mind quiet. The ghost of Leo was gone, banished by the storm. But she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. She had sought oblivion, but Julian had been true to his word. She had only been filled with more of him, his brand seared even deeper into her soul. There were moments, rare and treacherous, when the arrangement almost felt normal. Moments like this one, curled on a plush sofa in Julian's penthouse, a glass of wine in her hand, the city lights a silent, glittering tapestry below. The storm of their last encounter had given way to a quiet, almost domestic calm. They had spoken of art, of a new exhibition at the Met, and for a little while, she could almost pretend they were just two people sharing a quiet evening. She could almost ignore the fact that her presence here was a transaction, that the clothes on her back were purchased by him, that her soul was on his ledger. This sense of normalcy was the most dangerous illusion of all, a sedative that dulled the sharp edges of her shame and made her forget the precarious, fragile nature of this double life. It was a beautiful, peaceful lie, and it was about to be obliterated. The shrill electronic sound that shattered the quiet was Julian's private phone. It was a sound that always made her tense, but he answered it with a casual ease, his voice shifting from the low, intimate tone he used with her to something warmer, more familiar. "Leo." What a surprise. Alara froze. The wine glass in her hand felt suddenly slick, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. "Leo." The name was a physical blow, a ghost materializing in the heart of her gilded cage. She watched Julian's face, his expression unreadable, as he listened. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "You're where?" Julian said, a note of carefully controlled surprise in his voice. "In the lobby?" "Well, that's ambitious of you. I'm just finishing up a business call. Give me a few minutes." He listened again, his eyes flicking towards her for a fraction of a second, a look so cold and quick it was like a shard of glass. No, don't wait down there. Come on up, the elevator is keyed for you. I'll see you in a moment." He ended the call. The silence that descended upon the room was no longer peaceful, but predatory. Leo was here, in the building, coming up in the elevator. The reality of it was a white-hot poker of panic in her mind. Her two worlds, so carefully, so desperately kept separate, were about to collide with catastrophic force. She couldn't breathe. Her heart was a wild, frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Before she could even process the terror, Julian was in motion. There was no panic in him, only a chilling, absolute efficiency. "Get dressed," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "Now, leave the wine." He was already moving through the room, his eyes scanning for any trace of her. He snatched the throw blanket from the sofa where she had been sitting, folding it with brisk, economical movements. He was erasing her. Her own body felt clumsy, disconnected from her brain. Her limbs were heavy, her fingers numb and useless. She stumbled into the bedroom, her dress a heap of black silk on the floor. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely grasp the fabric. The sound of her own ragged breathing filled her ears, punctuated by the frantic thumping of her heart. She could hear the faint, distant hum of the elevator, a sound that was now the soundtrack to her worst nightmare. She fumbled with the zipper of her dress, her mind a screaming void. "He's coming. He's coming. Leo is coming." "Shoes." Julian's voice cut through her panic from the doorway. He was holding her coat, his face a mask of cold concentration. "Where are your shoes, Alara?" She looked around wildly. She'd kicked them off somewhere. Under the bed, she dropped to her hands and knees, her dress half-zipped, scrambling for them, the rough underside of the bed frame scraping her knuckles. She found one, then the other, and shoved her feet into them, not caring that she'd twisted the strap on one, her purse. It was on the marble countertop in the master bathroom. She ran to get it, her mind racing. What else? What had she touched? Was there a stray hair on a pillow? A smudge of her lipstick on a glass? Julian was right behind her. "We don't have time for a full sweep," he said, as if reading her mind. "We have to go." He grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruisingly tight, and pulled her from the bedroom. As they rushed through the grand living area, her eyes darted to the small table beside the sofa where she'd set her earrings down earlier. She scooped them up, her clumsy fingers trying to push the posts through her earlobes as she moved. One went in. The other, a small, elegant drop of pearl and gold, slipped from her trembling grasp. It hit the thick rug with a sickeningly soft thud and disappeared, rolling into the dark space beneath the heavy, ornate sofa. "Julian," she gasped, her voice choked with terror. "My earring." "Leave it," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He was already pulling her past the main entrance, towards the far side of the penthouse, a part of the apartment she had never been in. "There's no time." The thought of leaving a piece of herself here, a piece of tangible evidence, was horrifying, but the thought of Leo's face when he saw her was infinitely worse. Julian stopped in front of a wall of dark, polished wood that she had always assumed was part of the library. He pressed a specific, unmarked section of the paneling, and a door swung silently inward, revealing not a closet but a stark, narrow corridor and a set of steel doors. A service elevator. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This escape route had been built for this exact purpose. The chilling thought that she was not the first secret he had needed to smuggle out of his perfect life was almost as sickening as the fear of being caught. He pushed her inside the cold steel box, the door sliding shut with a grim finality. The elevator smelled of bleach and industrial cleaning fluid. It was a different world from the perfumed, silent luxury of the main lift. This was the elevator for the staff, for the trash, for the mistresses. The descent was jarringly fast, a stomach-lurching plunge back to reality. Julian stood beside her, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the floor indicator. He hadn't even broken a sweat. The elevator opened into a dim, concrete parking garage. The air was cool and damp, smelling of exhaust fumes. He led her to a sleek black sedan parked in a private spot near the exit, a car she'd never seen before. He opened the passenger door. "Get in. The driver will take you home. Do not call me. Do not text me. I will contact you when it is safe." His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. He was a general dismissing a soldier from a compromised battlefield. She slid into the car, her body still shaking. As the car pulled away, she looked back. Julian was already gone, disappeared back into the building to play the part of the surprised father for his visiting son. The car sped out of the garage and into the night, but she wasn't looking at the road. Her gaze was fixed on the glittering monolith of the Vance Tower, at the single, brightly lit rectangle of the penthouse suite high above. She imagined Leo stepping out of the elevator, smiling, into the room she had just fled. She imagined him sitting on the very sofa where she and his father had been entwined, completely unaware of the betrayal that permeated the very air he was breathing. And somewhere, in the shadows beneath that sofa, a single pearl earring lay like a landmine, waiting to be found. The near miss was not an escape, it was just a delay of the inevitable explosion. For 3 days, silence was her tormentor. Julian's final command, "Do not contact me," had severed the only line to her new reality, leaving her adrift in a sea of pure, agonizing suspense. She existed in the 4 small rooms of her apartment, a self-imposed prisoner pacing a cell of her own making. Every creak of the floorboards in the hall outside her door was Leo, coming to confront her. Every ring of a distant phone was Julian, calling to cast her out. She obsessively checked her phone, but the screen remained dark, a black mirror reflecting her own terrified face. Sleep offered no escape, only fractured nightmares of Leo's kind, trusting face morphing into a mask of horrified accusation as he held up a single pearl earring. The earring. It was a constant, searing image in her mind. A tiny, ticking time bomb she had left behind in the heart of her carefully constructed web of lies. She couldn't stop imagining the moment of its discovery. She played the scene over and over in her head, a form of self-torture, each imagined detail more vivid and terrifying than the last. In her mind's eye, she saw Leo visiting his father again, perhaps a day or 2 later, the tension of the surprise visit having faded into a fragile, familiar father-son dynamic. They would be in the living room, sharing a drink, the picture of normalcy. Leo would laugh at something his father said, leaning back on the sofa. Perhaps he'd drop his phone, or a pen. He would reach down into the space between the cushions, his fingers searching, and then he would feel it, something small, hard, and foreign. He would pull it out, his brow furrowed in curiosity. He would hold it in the palm of his hand, a tiny glint of gold and pearl under the soft lamplight. She could almost feel his recognition, a slow, cold dawning. It wasn't just any earring, it was her style. Delicate, classic, understated. He had bought her a similar pair for her birthday once, years ago, a memory that would now be a clue. The confrontation, as she imagined it, would be quiet, which was somehow more terrifying than a shouting match. Leo wouldn't accuse, he would test. He would hold up the earring, a slight, questioning smile on his face. "Finders keepers, I guess," he would say, his eyes never leaving his father's. "Funny. This looks exactly like a pair Alara Collins used to wear." The name, her name, hanging in the air between them, a loaded question, and Julian would not falter. Her imagination could perfectly conjure his reaction, a performance of masterful deception. He would look at the earring, a flicker of what looked like thoughtful recognition in his eyes. He wouldn't deny it or become defensive. He would simply craft a more perfect reality. "Ah, that must be Catherine's," he would say with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Catherine DeWitt, from the Sotheby's board. She and her husband, Robert, were here for drinks on Tuesday. She's always losing things. A charming woman, but hopelessly flighty. The lie was a work of art in its perfection. It was specific. It had a name, a context, a plausible backstory. It was a lie that invited no further questions. A thick velvet curtain dropped over a dangerous truth, and Leo, her sweet, trusting Leo, would have no choice but to accept it. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the seed of suspicion would be planted, a tiny, poisonous seed in the back of his mind that would, with time, begin to grow. On the 4th day, her phone finally rang. It was him. She answered with a hand that did not tremble, her body now numb with sustained anxiety. "It's handled," Julian said, his voice cold and devoid of any comforting warmth. There was no, "Are you all right?" There was only a clinical report. He told her the story, almost exactly as she had imagined it. Leo had found the earring. He had asked about it. Julian had fabricated the story of Catherine DeWitt. "He believed me," Julian stated, but there was an edge to his voice. "For now, it was a loose end, Alara, an act of profound carelessness. I do not tolerate loose ends. Be more careful." The call ended. It was not a reprieve. It was a confirmation of how close she had come to utter ruin, and a chilling reprimand from her owner. The web of lies had held, but a single thread had been pulled, and the entire structure felt unstable. The aftermath of the call was not relief, but the beginning of a deep and gnawing paranoia. The seed of suspicion wasn't just in Leo's mind. It was now a rampant weed in hers. The world outside her apartment became a landscape of threats. A car idling for too long on her street was an investigator hired by Leo. A man on the subway who seemed to glance at her more than once was following her. Every unknown number that called her phone sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She had been careless. The thought echoed Julian's words and became her mantra. Her beautiful new clothes, the gifts from Julian, now felt like a costume that could be her undoing. Did the cashmere sweater hold a stray hair that Leo might recognize? Did the expensive perfume she wore leave a ghost of its scent in his father's car, a scent he might one day notice on the air and remember? The gilded cage was no longer a place of comfort and security. It was a torture chamber of her own anxiety. The money in her bank account, the money that had saved her family, felt tainted, a glowing beacon that pointed directly to her sin. She stopped going out unless absolutely necessary. She would stand at her window for hours, peering through the blinds at the street below, seeing every passerby as a potential accuser, a member of a jury that was slowly assembling to pass judgment on her. The web of lies was no longer an abstract concept, a strategy for survival. It was a physical thing, its sticky threads clinging to her skin, wrapping around her throat. She had bought her family's freedom, but the price was her own peace of mind. She was a prisoner, locked in a cell of paranoia, and she was beginning to understand that from this prison, there would be no escape. The paranoia did not recede. It simply burrowed deeper, becoming a permanent resident in the architecture of her thoughts. When Julian's summons came a week after the incident with the earring, she went to him with a kind of fatalistic numbness. She was a soldier reporting for duty, her emotional armor firmly in place, expecting the usual cold command and the grim fulfillment of her contract. But the man she found waiting in the penthouse was not the one she had prepared for. The mask was off. He wasn't in a suit, but a simple gray t-shirt and dark trousers, and he looked tired. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. The usual intimidating energy that radiated from him was banked, like the embers of a dying fire. He didn't greet her with a demand or a possessive kiss. He simply handed her a glass of wine and gestured to the sofa. For a long time, they sat in silence, a strange and unfamiliar quiet that was different from their usual tense, unspoken standoffs. This was a weary silence, heavy with an unspoken melancholy. He stared out at the city, but for the first time, he didn't look like a king surveying his domain. He looked like a prisoner staring through the bars of his cell. "I closed the Henderson deal today," he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of the triumph she would have expected. "Made the firm 9 figures. We celebrated with champagne that cost more than a car. And I felt absolutely nothing." Alara listened, wary, searching for the angle, the new form of manipulation. But as he continued to speak, his voice remained low and toneless, the words spilling out as if from a crack in a dam. He spoke of his wife, not with anger, but with a profound, decades-old exhaustion. He called their marriage the longest, most successful merger in Vance history. A union of 2 prominent families, a partnership of assets and social standing. "We haven't shared a real conversation in 20 years, he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "We share a portfolio. We co-host charity events. At our son's graduation, we stood on either side of him, smiling for the cameras, and I swear we could have been 2 strangers who just happened to be standing next to each other." He spoke of the crushing loneliness of the summit, of being surrounded by sycophants and rivals, of having a life so meticulously curated that there was no room left for anything genuine. A strange, unwelcome feeling began to stir in Alara's chest. It was sympathy. It was a dangerous, traitorous emotion, but it was undeniable. She, who had felt so utterly alone in her own desperation, was now listening to a man who had everything, and he was describing the very same soul-deep isolation she knew so well. He was not a monster. He was just a man trapped in a different kind of cage. "It must be difficult," she said, the words quiet, barely a whisper, "to have no one to share the victory with, or the failures." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were different. The usual cool, assessing gaze was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. He seemed surprised that she understood, that she hadn't offered a simple platitude. In that moment, the power dynamic that defined their entire relationship seemed to dissolve. They were not patron and mistress, captor and captive. They were just two profoundly lonely people, sitting in a glass box in the sky, confessing their secrets to the uncaring city lights. He saw her, she realized. Not just her body, not just the object he had purchased, but the person inside, the one who recognized the unique shape of his pain because it so closely resembled her own. He reached out, his movement slow, almost hesitant, and touched her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. It was a touch unlike any he had ever given her before. It was not possessive or demanding. It was questioning, searching, infinitely tender. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of their shared brokenness. The air between them shifted, charged now not with tension or lust, but with a fragile, aching intimacy. He leaned in and kissed her, and the kiss was a revelation. There was no fury, no desperation, no cold transaction. It was soft, slow, and deeply sad, a kiss of pure, unadulterated loneliness. He led her to the bedroom, and what unfolded between the silk sheets was not sex in the way she had come to know it with him. It was a search for solace. Every movement was slow, every touch was gentle. He held her as if she were made of glass, his eyes holding hers, a silent, desperate communication passing between them. He was not taking from her, he was seeking refuge in her, and she, in turn, found a strange, heartbreaking comfort in his arms. She was no longer just a body performing a function, she was a comfort, a confidant. For a few, stolen, tragic hours, they were not their roles. They were just a man and a woman, finding a fleeting, illusory warmth in each other, a temporary shelter from the cold reality of their lives. It was an intimacy so profound, so unexpected, that it felt more violating than his previous aggressions. His cruelty had been easy to categorize, to wall off. This tenderness breached every defense she had, seeping into the cracks in her soul. Later, as he slept beside her, his face in repose looking years older, more vulnerable than she could ever have imagined, Alara lay awake, her mind in turmoil. The clean, simple lines of their arrangement had been irrevocably blurred. He was no longer a monster she could hate, which had been, in its own way, a comfort. Now, he was a man she pitied, a man she understood, a man for whom she felt a twisted, dangerous affection. This was a new kind of trap, far more complex and inescapable than the financial one she had first entered. She was bound to him now not just by money, but by shared secrets, by a bond forged in mutual loneliness. She had thought the greatest danger was being discovered by Leo, but she was wrong. The greatest danger had been here all along, the risk of seeing the man behind the monster and of him, in turn, truly seeing her. The strange tenderness that had bloomed between Alara and Julian did not simplify their arrangement. It complicated it to a torturous degree. The clean lines of their transaction had been replaced by a messy, emotional entanglement that left her constantly off balance. She found herself analyzing his moods, searching for the vulnerable man behind the corporate titan, a dangerous habit that made her feel less like a mistress and more like a confidante. This new intimacy was a more potent drug than the luxury he provided, and it made her careless. She started to believe, in some small, foolish corner of her heart, that the fragile world they had built in the penthouse was somehow separate from the real one, that it was a secret so profound it could never be discovered. Meanwhile, the poisonous seed of suspicion Julian had so carelessly allowed to be planted in his son's mind had been growing. Leo was no longer the naive, trusting boy Alara remembered. The lie about the earring had bothered him, an elegant solution that felt too neat, too perfect. He had called her a few more times, his tone shifting from warm nostalgia to a subtle, questioning probe. He asked about her work, her mysterious collector, with a new edge to his voice, fishing for details she artfully evaded. He was a good man, searching for a truth he was terrified to find, and his search was becoming more focused, more relentless. The thread that unraveled everything was, in the end, a simple coincidence, a cruel twist of fate in a city of millions. A mutual friend from college, a woman named Sarah, whom Alara hadn't seen in 2 years, had recently started a job in a skyscraper directly opposite Julian's residential tower. One Tuesday afternoon, Sarah had been looking out her office window when she saw a familiar figure with long, chestnut hair step out of a black town car and walk into the grand lobby of the Vance Tower. A week later, she saw her again. Confused and perhaps a little concerned, she had called Leo. "Hey, this is a weird question," she had said, "but is Alara Collins working for your dad now? I keep seeing her go into his private apartment building." The call was the final, brutal confirmation for Leo, his father's apartment building, not his office. The lie about the private collector, the earring, Alara's sudden financial stability, it all crashed together in his mind, forming a picture so ugly, so monstrous, he could barely comprehend it. He did one last thing. He called the public relations department at Sotheby's and inquired about their board members. As he had suspected, there was no Catherine DeWitt. The name was a phantom, a lie crafted by his father to hide an unthinkable truth. Alara knew none of this. She was returning from an afternoon with Julian, an afternoon that had been filled with that same confusing tenderness. He had given her a rare first edition of a book on pre-Raphaelite art, a thoughtful, personal gift that made her heart ache with a feeling she refused to name. As the car dropped her off a block from her apartment, a fine, cold mist was beginning to fall, blurring the city lights. She felt a familiar melancholy settle over her, the jarring transition from his world of quiet luxury back to her own solitary existence. She was walking toward the entrance of her building, her head down, when a figure stepped out from the shadows of the doorway, blocking her path. Her first instinct was fear, a jolt of urban paranoia. But then the figure spoke her name, and the world stopped turning. It was Leo. But it was a version of him she had never seen before. The easy smile was gone, the warmth in his eyes extinguished. His face was pale and drawn, his expression one of preternatural, terrifying calm. He looked like a man who had just walked away from a devastating wreckage, his soul still smoldering. "Hello, Alara," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion at all. It was the lack of anger that terrified her. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a sentencing. "Leo," she breathed, her heart seizing in her chest. "What are you doing here?" "I came for the truth," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "I'm tired of the lies." He took a small step closer, and she could smell the cold rain on his jacket. "Sarah called me. She works across the street from my father's building. She saw you, Alara, not once, but several times, going into his home." Every word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall between them she knew she could never break down. "And the earring," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There is no Catherine DeWitt. I checked." She had no defense. There were no more lies to tell. No more evasions to offer. The intricate web she and Julian had woven was torn to shreds at her feet. She could only stare at him, her face crumbling, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free. His calm finally cracked, his face contorting with a pain so profound it was like a physical wound. His voice broke, the question, a ragged, agonizing sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "All this time, you've been with him?" he asked, the words barely audible. "My own father?" The question demanded a final, brutal honesty, and through a torrent of gut-wrenching sobs, she gave it to him. The confession was not a clean sentence, but a chaotic, broken mess of her shame and her pathetic justifications. "I'm sorry," she wept, the words tearing from her throat. "The debt, my mom was so sick. I didn't know what else to do. I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry." She was begging, not for his forgiveness, because she knew she didn't deserve it, but for some impossible understanding, for some way to undo the cataclysm she had caused. He didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He just watched her break down, his expression shifting from pain to a look of cold, clear disgust. The confirmation of the truth was the final blow, and it had killed whatever love he had once felt for her, leaving only ashes. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, a creature he had never truly known. "My father," he said, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. He shook his head slowly, a look of hollow disbelief on his face. He had been betrayed by the two people in the world he should have been able to trust the most. He finally looked at her one last time, his eyes completely empty. "I hope the money was worth it," he said, the words a quiet final judgment, and then he turned and walked away into the misting rain, not looking back. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving her utterly, completely alone on the cold, wet sidewalk. The threat of discovery was over. The agonizing suspense was gone. It was replaced by the crushing, absolute certainty of her ruin. The truth was out, and it had destroyed everything. The explosion of the truth was followed by a silence more devastating than any screaming match. The severing of ties was brutally swift. From Leo, there was a single text message that night, a blast of pure, unadulterated pain and finality. "I never want to see you again, either of you. You are both dead to me." And then, his number was blocked. He vanished from her life as completely as if he had never existed. From Julian, the end came with the cold, bloodless efficiency of a corporate downsizing. The next morning, a final monumental sum of money appeared in her bank account, enough to secure her family's future for a lifetime. It was followed not by a call from him, but by an email from his personal assistant. The subject line was simply, "Conclusion of agreement." The body of the message was brief and sterile. "Mr. Vance considers your arrangement concluded and all obligations fulfilled. He wishes you well in your future endeavors." That was all. No apology, no explanation, no farewell. She had been a transaction, and the account was now closed. She used the money as intended. The last of the medical debt was vaporized. She bought her parents a small, comfortable house in a quiet suburban neighborhood and set up a trust to ensure her mother's care for the rest of her life. She had done it. She had saved them. She had fulfilled the desperate promise she'd made to herself in the darkest hours of the night. But the victory was utterly hollow. The relief she had dreamed of for so long never came. In saving her family, she had orphaned herself, cutting herself off from the only person who had ever truly known her, and becoming a pariah in her own life story. The seasons changed. A year passed, then another. Alara disappeared. She took a portion of the money, moved to a small, quiet town in a state where no one knew her name, and she began to build a life out of the ashes. She worked in a local library, the hushed, orderly silence of the stacks, a welcome balm for her fractured soul. She lived in a small, simple apartment, furnished with secondhand pieces she chose herself. She wore plain, comfortable clothes. She had meticulously erased every trace of the woman Julian Vance had created, the woman who wore silk and pearls. But she could not resurrect the girl she had been before him. That girl was gone forever. She was a ghost now, haunting the quiet space between who she was and who she had been forced to become. She was financially free, but she lived in a psychological prison, the memories her constant, silent wardens. The haunting came in waves, triggered by the simplest things. A sudden, heavy downpour against the library windows would transport her back to the penthouse, to the feeling of Julian's body against hers, the storm outside a mirror to the one inside her. The scent of a stranger's expensive cologne in the grocery store aisle would make her heart seize with a familiar, sickening lurch. Every time she saw a sleek, black town car, she would feel a phantom urge to run, to hide. She had escaped the cage, but its shadow stretched long, following her wherever she went. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would lie awake and feel the ghost of his hands on her skin, remembering the brutal passion, the unexpected tenderness, the cold ownership. She had paid the price, and she had received her prize, but the transaction had marked her, branded her in a way that time could not fade. Then, one autumn afternoon, nearly 3 years after she had vanished, a package arrived for her at the library. It had no return address, only a simple, typewritten label with her name. Her heart began to pound with a slow, heavy dread she hadn't felt since her last days in the city. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, there was no note, no letter. There was only a book. It was a beautiful leather-bound first edition of a collection of essays on the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a rare volume she had mentioned to Julian once, in a moment of quiet, intellectual conversation. She sank into a chair, her fingers tracing the gold-leaf title. It was a ghost, a message from a world she had fought so hard to leave behind. It was not a threat. It was not a plea for reconciliation. It was something far more chilling. It was a statement of fact. It said, "I remember you. It said, "I know where you are." It said, "I can still reach you whenever I choose." It was a final, quiet assertion of his power, a reminder that a part of her would always be his, a piece in his vast collection. He had let her go, but he would never truly set her free. She held the beautiful, heavy book in her lap, the silence of the library pressing in on her. She had her quiet life. Her mother was safe. The debt was a distant memory. She had everything she had sacrificed herself to obtain. She looked up at her own pale, ghostly reflection in the dark library window, a quiet woman surrounded by a million other people's stories, her own too terrible to tell. And the question, the one that had been the silent subtext of her every waking moment for years, hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Was it worth it?